He was just a quiet custodian mopping floors at the Meridian Financial Tower, invisible to everyone until four armed men stormed the executive boardroom and cornered the tech billionaire. No one knew his past. No one expected what he'd do next. But when his 8-year-old daughter whispered from behind a supply cart, "Daddy, why is that lady crying?" everything changed. What happened that night would expose deadly corporate secrets, reveal a military operation that officially never existed, and awaken a connection neither of them saw coming. This isn't just a rescue story, Dot. It's about a man haunted by missions that broke international law, a woman whose empire was built on lies, and the moment when two damaged souls discover that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone overlooks. The truth about Theric Corvin's past will disturb you, but his choice to act will restore your faith in humanity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Meridian Financial Tower gleamed against the Seattle skyline like a monument to ambition. Its 47 floors of glass and steel reflecting the gray autumn clouds that perpetually hovered over the city. Inside, the building hummed with the quiet efficiency of money being moved, deals being struck, and fortunes being made or lost with the click of a mouse. Theric Corvin pushed his cleaning cart through the marble lobby at exactly 6:30 p.m., just as he had every weeknight for the past 3 years. The wheels squeaked slightly, a sound he'd grown accustomed to, along with the weight of the industrial vacuum cleaner and the smell of commercial-grade floor cleaner that seemed permanently embedded in his clothes. At 34, he moved with an economy of motion that most people mistook for the careful precision of someone afraid to break expensive things. They were wrong. Theric's movements came from somewhere else entirely, a place he'd buried so deep that sometimes he almost forgot it existed. His daughter Riley sat, cross-legged behind the security desk, her backpack open beside her, homework spread across the granite surface. At 8 years old, she had inherited her father's dark hair and steady gaze, but where his eyes held shadows of things he'd never speak about, hers sparkled with the kind of curiosity that made her ask questions about everything. She wore a purple sweater with a cartoon cat on it and mismatched socks, one striped, one polka-dotted, because she'd declared matching socks boring 6 months ago, and Theric had decided that was a battle not worth fighting. "Dad, why do rich people need so many bathrooms?" Riley asked, looking up from her math worksheet. "Mrs. Patterson in 4B only has one bathroom, and she seems fine." Theric smiled, the first genuine expression his face had worn all day. "Different priorities, kiddo. Some people think having more things makes them more important. That's dumb," Riley said matter-of-factly. Returning to her multiplication problems, the security guard, an older man named Frank who'd worked the building for 12 years, chuckled from behind his monitors. "Your daughter's got more sense than most of the people who ride those elevators up to the top floors." Theric nodded, though his attention had shifted to the bank of security screens Frank monitored. It was habit, something he couldn't shake no matter how many years passed. Always watch the exits. Always note who doesn't belong. Always have an escape route planned. The habits of his former life had become the mundane vigilance of a night janitor, and most days he was grateful for the transformation. 43 floors above them, Cindy Farrowin stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office, watching the city lights flicker to life as darkness settled over Seattle. At 39, she was the founder and CEO of Quantum Dynamics, a financial technology company that had revolutionized how institutional investors analyzed market data. Her company's algorithms could predict market fluctuations with an accuracy that bordered on supernatural, and that capability had made her one of the youngest billionaires on the West Coast. She wore a tailored, charcoal suit that had probably cost more than Theric made in a month, her auburn hair pulled back in a style that was both professional and elegant. But despite the trappings of success that surrounded her, there was something fragile about the way she held herself. as if she were always braced for impact from a direction she couldn't see coming. Cindy's office occupied half of the 43rd floor, with glass walls that offered a panoramic view of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. The space was decorated with modern art that she'd purchased, not because she loved it, but because her interior designer had assured her it projected the right image. A collection of awards and recognition plaques lined one wall, though she rarely looked at them anymore. Success, she'd learned, was often lonelier than failure. Her assistant had left hours ago, along with most of the building's occupants. Cindy preferred working late, when the phone stopped ringing and the constant stream of meetings finally ended. It was during these quiet hours that she did her real thinking, the kind of strategic planning that had built her empire. Tonight, however, she felt restless in a way she couldn't quite identify. 3 floors below her, in a conference room that reeked of stale coffee and nervous sweat, 4 men sat around a polished mahogany table reviewing building blueprints and security protocols. They'd been planning this operation for 6 weeks, ever since their employer had made it clear that Cindy Farrowin's cooperation was no longer optional. The leader, a man named Vincent Shaw, had the kind of face that people forgot 5 minutes after meeting him, which had made him very successful in his particular line of work. His 3 companions were younger, hungrier, and significantly less careful about collateral damage. Building security is minimal after 7 p.m., Shaw said, his voice barely above a whisper. 1 guard in the lobby, basic camera surveillance, keycard access to the upper floors. The real challenge is getting her to cooperate without creating a scene that brings the wrong kind of attention. What if she refuses? Asked Marcus, the youngest of the group, whose nervous energy had been making Shaw increasingly irritated throughout their planning sessions. She won't. Shaw replied with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. Everyone cooperates eventually. It's just a matter of presenting the right motivation. They didn't know about Theric Corvan. They'd seen him on the security footage, of course. Just another piece of background scenery in the building's daily routine. A custodian with a small daughter who sometimes stayed late to finish her homework while he worked. Invisible, harmless, irrelevant to their carefully constructed plan. Back in the lobby, Riley had finished her math homework and moved on to a book about marine biology that was probably 2 grade levels above what she should have been reading. She'd always been advanced for her age, something that both proud and worried Theric. Smart kids asked difficult questions, and some questions were harder to answer than others. Dad, did you know that octopuses have 3 hearts? Riley said without looking up from her book. I didn't know that, Theric replied, though he actually had. There were a lot of things he knew that he'd never found a good way to explain to his daughter. Frank yawned and stretched in his chair. Quiet night, he observed. Most folks cleared out by 6. Just a few of the workaholic executives still up in their towers, burning the midnight oil. Theric nodded, but something felt different tonight. He couldn't pinpoint what it was, just a subtle shift in the building's atmosphere that made his old instincts stir uneasily. The elevator had made more trips to the lower floors than usual. 3 different delivery services had come and gone during the afternoon, which wasn't necessarily unusual, but the timing felt off. Small details that probably meant nothing, but which his trained mind filed away automatically. Riley closed her book and looked up at her father with the serious expression she wore when she was about to ask one of her difficult questions. Dad, why do you clean buildings instead of doing something more important? The question hit harder than it should have. Theric paused in his methodical wiping down of the security desk, considering his words carefully. What makes you think cleaning isn't important, kiddo? I mean, you're really smart. You know things about science and history and math that even my teachers don't know. You could probably do any job you wanted. Frank looked up with interest. In 3 years of working the same shift, he'd noticed the same thing about the quiet custodian. Theric Corvan was clearly educated, clearly intelligent, and clearly running from something that had driven him to seek out the kind of anonymous work that didn't require extensive background checks or references. Sometimes, the most important work is the kind that nobody notices, Therick said finally. Making sure people have clean, safe spaces to work and think and create things. Taking care of the details so other people can focus on bigger problems. It wasn't a complete lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth was that Therick Corvan had once been very good at solving certain kinds of problems, the kind that required skills he no longer wanted to use. He'd traded a world of violence and moral ambiguity for the simple, honest work of making things clean and orderly. Some nights, when he watched Riley sleeping peacefully in their small apartment, he thought it might have been the best decision he'd ever made. Other nights, when the dreams came, he wasn't so sure. The building settled around them with the subtle creaks and sighs of a structure cooling after a day of activity. Outside, traffic moved through the streets in the predictable patterns of evening rush hour. Everything appeared normal, routine, unremarkable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Therick Corvan had no way of knowing that normal was about to end. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the ground floor at 8:47 p.m., 3 minutes ahead of the schedule Vincent Shaw had calculated down to the second. The doors opened to reveal 4 men in dark suits, their faces calm and professional, their movements coordinated in a way that spoke of extensive planning and practice. To a casual observer, they might have been late-arriving executives or security consultants. To someone with Therick's background, they were obviously something else entirely. Frank glanced up from this crossword puzzle as the men approached his desk. "Evening, gentlemen. Building's mostly closed for business, but I can call up to any office you need to reach." Shaw smiled with the practiced warmth of someone who'd spent years learning how to put people at ease before disappointing them. "Actually, we're here for a scheduled meeting with Miss Farrowin, Quantum Dynamics, 43rd floor. She's expecting us. Let me just call up and confirm," Frank said, reaching for his phone. "That won't be necessary," Shaw replied, and suddenly the smile was gone. The man to his left, Marcus, had moved around the side of the security desk with a speed that made Frank's hand freeze halfway to the phone. Therick felt the shift in the atmosphere like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. He'd been emptying trash cans near the elevator bank, moving through the familiar routine with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything, when something in the way the 4 men carried themselves triggered every alarm his mind possessed. Their posture was too controlled, their spacing too tactical, their awareness of the room's exits too professional. Riley looked up from her book, sensing the change in tension, even if she couldn't identify what was causing it. "Dad?" "Stay exactly where you are, sweetheart," Therick said quietly, not taking his eyes off the men at the security desk. "Keep reading your book." His daughter was smart enough to hear the tone beneath his calm words. She opened her book again, but her eyes weren't moving across the pages. Shaw pulled out a device that looked like a smartphone, but wasn't quite the right size or shape. He pressed a button, and suddenly every monitor behind Frank's desk went dark. The building's security cameras, its keycard access logs, its emergency communication systems, all of it shut down with the efficiency of a system that had been specifically designed to be vulnerable to this kind of attack. "Gentlemen, we have a problem," Frank said, his voice carefully steady. He was former military himself, Therick knew, though he'd never spoken about his service beyond mentioning that he'd done some time overseas. Now that experience was showing in the way he assessed the situation without panic. "No problem at all," Shaw replied. "Just a temporary technical difficulty. We'll have everything back to normal very soon." Marcus had moved behind the security desk now, and Therick could see the outline of something beneath his jacket that definitely wasn't a phone or a wallet. The other 2 men had positioned themselves to control the lobby's main exits. their casual stance fooling no one who understood tactical positioning. Therek's mind shifted into a mode of thinking he hadn't accessed in years. Threat assessment, resource inventory, tactical options. The lobby offered good sightlines but limited cover. His cleaning cart contained various chemicals that could be weaponized if necessary. The building's emergency systems had backup power that Shaw's device might not have affected. Riley was approximately 15 feet from the nearest exit, but getting to her would require crossing open ground under observation. "I'm going to need you gentlemen to state your business here," Frank said, his hand moving slowly towards something beneath his desk that Therek suspected wasn't just a panic button. "Our business is with Ms. Farrowen," Shaw replied patiently. "A simple conversation about some financial irregularities that have come to light. Nothing that concerns building security." The lie was smooth and professional, the kind of partial truth that worked on people who wanted to believe that reasonable explanations existed for unreasonable situations. But Therek had heard too many similar lies in too many similar situations to find this one convincing. He moved closer to Riley, his cleaning supplies cart providing cover while he assessed the tactical situation. 4 attackers, unknown weapons capability, electronic surveillance compromised, civilian casualties a primary concern. The math was not encouraging. "Dad," Riley whispered, her voice barely audible. "Those men are lying." Out of the mouths of 8-year-olds. Therek felt a surge of pride in his daughter's perceptiveness, followed immediately by fear for her safety. "I know, kiddo. Just stay calm and let Dad handle this." Shaw seemed to notice the custodian for the first time, his gaze passing over Therek with the dismissive assessment of someone cataloging potential problems. Janitor, single father, probably undocumented based on the kind of work he was doing. Unlikely to cause complications. Shaw filed him under irrelevant and returned his attention to Frank. "Now, if you'll just provide us with access to the 43rd floor, we can conclude our business and be out of your hair." Shaw continued. Frank's hand had reached whatever he kept under his desk. "I'm afraid I can't do that without proper authorization. Company policy." "I understand your position," Shaw said with what sounded like genuine sympathy. "But I'm afraid this situation has moved beyond normal company policy." Marcus stepped closer to Frank, his jacket falling open, just enough to reveal the grip of a pistol. "Maybe you'd like to reconsider that policy." That was the moment when Therek Corvan stopped being a custodian and started being something else entirely. The transition happened so smoothly that later, when he tried to explain it to Riley, he would struggle to identify exactly when he'd made the decision to act. 1 second he was watching the situation unfold with the helpless concern of a COSA civilian caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The next second, he was moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd been trained to solve problems that couldn't be solved with words. He palmed a small canister of industrial degreaser from his cart, his movements casual enough that none of Shaw's team noticed the gesture. The chemical wasn't designed to be a weapon, but Therek had learned long ago that the difference between tool and weapon often came down to creativity and desperation. "Riley," he said softly, never taking his eyes off the men near the security desk. "Remember the fire drill game we practiced?" His daughter nodded almost imperceptibly. The fire drill game had been Therek's way of teaching her basic emergency procedures without frightening her. If Daddy ever said the special word, she was supposed to go to a specific safe place and stay there until he came to get her. They'd never actually played the game in a real emergency, but Riley had always been a quick learner. Shaw was growing impatient with Frank's resistance. "I'm afraid we're going to need that access now. And I'm afraid you're going to need to speak with building management in the morning," Frank replied, his voice steady despite the obvious threat. Shaw nodded to Marcus, who pulled his gun and pointed it at Frank with the casual efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. "Let's try this conversation again." That was when Therek realized he was out of time for planning and preparation. Frank was about to be shot. Riley was 15 feet away from people who wouldn't hesitate to hurt a small girl if she became inconvenient. And Cindy Farrowin was 43 floors above them, with no idea that her world was about to change forever. Butterfly, Therick said quietly. Riley didn't ask questions. She slipped out of her chair and moved toward the emergency stairwell with the quick, silent steps her father had taught her during their games. None of Shaw's men noticed her movement. Their attention was focused entirely on Frank and the immediate problem of gaining access to the upper floors. Therick took a deep breath and prepared to become someone he'd hoped never to be again. Riley had made it to the stairwell door when everything went wrong at once. Marcus, growing impatient with Frank's continued resistance, raised his weapon toward the security guard's head. At the same moment, one of Shaw's men positioned near the elevator noticed Riley's movement toward the emergency exit. "We've got a kid trying to leave," the man called out, his voice cutting through the lobby's tense, quiet like a blade. Shaw's head snapped toward Riley, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to sharp calculation. An adult witness could be managed through fear or intimidation. A child was a different kind of problem, especially one who might already be outside the building and calling for help. "Bring her back," Shaw ordered. The man near the elevator started toward Riley, his hand moving inside his jacket. Therick watched his daughter freeze at the stairwell door, her small hand on the metal handle, her face turning back toward him with an expression that broke something fundamental in his chest. In that moment, Therick Corvan faced the choice he'd been avoiding for 3 years. He could remain invisible, just another civilian caught in an unfortunate situation, and hope that Shaw's team were professional enough to avoid unnecessary casualties. He could trust that whatever they wanted with Cindy Farrowin was a business matter that would be resolved without violence, that Riley would be safe if he just stayed quiet and compliant. Or he could act. "Wait," Therick called out, his voice carrying across the lobby with enough authority to make Shaw's man pause. "She's just a scared kid. Let me get her." Shaw studied Therick with new interest. The custodian had moved away from his cleaning cart, his posture subtly different, more centered. There was something in his voice that suggested he was accustomed to being listened to, which didn't match the profile of a minimum-wage janitor with immigration concerns. "You know what?" Shaw said slowly. "I think that's an excellent idea. Why don't you bring your daughter over here where we can all have a nice conversation together?" It was a trap, obviously. Once Riley was within reach, Shaw would have leverage over Therick that could be used to ensure his cooperation. But it also gave Therick something he needed, an excuse to move closer to the men threatening his daughter. "Riley, honey, come back over here," Therick called out, his voice calm despite the fear clawing at his throat. "These gentlemen just want to ask us a few questions." Riley looked at him with the kind of trust that only children possess, the absolute faith that Daddy would never let anything bad happen to her. She walked back toward the security desk, her steps small and reluctant, her book clutched against her chest like a shield. Therick moved to intercept her path, positioning himself between Riley and Shaw's men with movements that appeared casual but were actually calculated to the inch. The industrial degreaser was still palmed in his right hand, concealed by the angle of his body. His left hand rested on Riley's shoulder as she reached him, a gesture of comfort that also allowed him to control her position in the room. "There we go," Shaw said with false warmth. "Now everyone's together." Much better. Frank was still at his desk, his hand frozen near whatever emergency device he'd been reaching for. Marcus's gun remained pointed at his head, the threat clear even if unspoken. The 2 men controlling the exits had relaxed slightly now that the child was no longer attempting to leave, but their position still blocked any conventional escape route. "What do you want?" Therick asked, though he already knew the answer had something to do with the woman 43 floors above them. "Like I told your friend here, we just need to have a conversation with Miss Farrowin. Some financial irregularities that need to be cleared up." "Very boring business stuff," Therick nodded as if he found this explanation reasonable. Sounds like something that could wait until regular business hours. Shaw's smile became slightly less friendly. Unfortunately, the people I represent don't like to wait. They find it inefficient. The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Therick had worked with people who didn't like to wait, and he understood the implications. Whatever Cindy Farrowin had done or failed to do, Shaw's employers had moved beyond conventional business negotiations. This was an extraction operation, probably leading to coercion or worse. "Riley," Therick said softly, "remember what I taught you about staying calm when adults are having grown-up conversations?" His daughter nodded, though her grip on her book had tightened until her knuckles were white. "I need you to go sit in that chair over there," Therick continued, indicating a position near the wall that would give her cover if things went badly. "And no matter what happens, I need you to keep your head down and stay quiet. Can you do that for me?" Rayleigh's eyes searched his face, reading something in his expression that made her suddenly look older than her 8 years. "Are you going to be okay, Daddy?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with all the trust and fear that defined their relationship. Therick had built his entire life around protecting his daughter from the kind of violence and moral ambiguity that had once defined his existence. He'd chosen anonymity over recognition, manual labor over leadership, safety over significance. All of it to ensure that Riley would never have to see him as anything other than the gentle father who made her breakfast and helped with her homework and tucked her in at night with stories about brave princesses and clever rabbits. But now those careful boundaries were collapsing. Shaw's men weren't going to be satisfied with intimidating a security guard and accessing the upper floors. They'd seen Riley, which made her a potential witness. They'd engaged with Therick, which made him a loose end. And somewhere above them, a woman who'd built an empire on predicting the unpredictable was about to discover that some threats couldn't be calculated away. "I'm going to be fine," Therick lied, the words coming out steady despite the certainty that fine was no longer an option for any of them. "I just need you to be my brave girl for a little while longer." Riley nodded and moved toward the chair he'd indicated, her steps careful and quiet. As she settled into position, she looked back at him one more time, and in that glance Therick saw something that nearly broke his resolve. She knew, maybe not the details, maybe not the full scope of what was about to happen, but she understood that her father was about to become someone different than the man who'd raised her. Shaw watched this exchange with the professional interest of someone evaluating tactical variables. Touching family moment. "But I'm afraid we really do need to move this along." "Of course," Therick agreed. "Just tell me what you need from us." "What I need," Shaw said, his voice hardening, "is for you and your daughter to stay exactly where you are while my associates and I conclude our business upstairs. Think you can manage that?" Therick looked around the lobby, taking in the positions of Shaw's men, the sight lines from Riley's chair, the distance to various exits and cover points. His mind was working on multiple levels now, calculating possibilities and probabilities with the kind of tactical thinking that had once been second nature to him. "That depends," Therick said quietly. Shaw raised an eyebrow. "On what?" "On whether your business upstairs involves hurting an innocent woman." The words came out before Therick could stop them, a reflection of the moral code that had driven him out of his previous life and into the safe anonymity of janitorial work. He'd spent 3 years trying to forget that some fights were worth the cost, that some people were worth protecting, even when protection came with a price too high to calculate. Shaw's expression shifted, becoming more alert, more focused. "And why would that concern a janitor?" Therick met his gaze directly, no longer bothering to maintain the fiction of harmless invisibility. "Because janitors clean up messes. And I've gotten very good at recognizing the kind of mess that starts with men like you." The lobby fell silent, except for the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Marcus's gun remained pointed at Frank, But his attention had shifted to the custodian, who was suddenly speaking like someone familiar with violence. The two men controlling the exits had straightened, their casual poses replaced by something more alert. Shaw studied Therick with new interest, his earlier dismissal replaced by careful assessment. "You know what, Mr. Janitor? I think you and I should have a more private conversation," he nodded to Marcus, who shifted his aim from Frank to Riley. That was the moment when Therick Curvan stopped being a father trying to protect his daughter and became something far more dangerous. The transformation was complete and irreversible, triggered by the simple act of threatening the most important person in his world. "You just made a mistake," Therick said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet certainty that made trained killers pause and recalculate their odds. Shaw smiled, but the expression no longer reached his eyes. "Did I?" "Yes," Therick replied, and moved. The industrial degreaser hit Marcus directly in the eyes at the same moment. Therick's shoulder drove into the man's solar plexus. The chemical wasn't designed to be a weapon, but it was industrial-strength solvent, and the effect on human tissue was immediate and devastating. Marcus screamed, his hands flying to his face, the gun clattering across the marble floor as he collapsed. Therick didn't pause to watch him fall. He was already moving toward Shaw, his body flowing through combat positions that muscle memory had preserved despite 3 years of deliberate neglect. The cleaning cart became a projectile, its weight and momentum carrying it into the legs of the man near the elevator, sending him sprawling across the polished floor. Shaw was reaching for his own weapon when Therick's elbow connected with his wrist, the impact precisely calculated to disrupt the draw without causing permanent damage. The gun spun away, sliding under the security desk where Frank was already diving for cover. "Stay down," Therick called to Riley, his voice calm despite the chaos erupting around him. His daughter had pressed herself against the wall behind her chair, her book held over her head like inadequate armor, but she was out of the immediate line of fire. The fourth man, the one Shaw had positioned near the main exit, was bringing up his weapon with professional speed. Therick grabbed a fire extinguisher from its wall mount and hurled it with the kind of accuracy that came from years of training in improvised weapons. The heavy cylinder caught the man in the chest, driving him backward into the glass doors hard enough to spider the security reinforced surface. Shaw recovered faster than Therick had expected, producing a backup weapon from an ankle holster with fluid efficiency. But Therick was already inside his effective range, using the close quarters to negate the gun's advantages. His left hand trapped Shaw's wrist while his right drove short, precise strikes into nerve clusters that would cause temporary paralysis, without lasting damage. It was a fighting style that few people would have recognized, combining elements of Krav Maga, tactical firearms disarmament, and close-quarters combat techniques that were officially classified. Therick moved with economical precision, wasting no motion, creating no unnecessary damage, but incapacitating threats with ruthless efficiency. Shaw went down hard, his weapon skittering across the floor to join Marcus's gun near the overturned cleaning cart. The man Therick had hit with the fire extinguisher was trying to rise, blood streaming from his nose, his own gun lost somewhere in the scattered debris of the lobby's previous order. The whole engagement had lasted less than 30 seconds. Therick stood in the center of the lobby, breathing hard but controlled, surrounded by the wreckage of Shaw's carefully planned operation. Marcus was curled on the floor, hands still pressed to his chemically burned eyes, his screams having subsided to pained moans. Shaw lay motionless near the security desk, unconscious but breathing. The other two men were conscious but clearly unwilling to continue the fight without weapons or coordination. Frank emerged from behind his desk, staring at the custodian he'd worked alongside for 3 years, as if seeing him for the first time. "Jesus Christ, Therick. What the hell was that?" Therick looked around the lobby, taking in the damage, the scattered weapons, the professional kidnappers lying defeated among the cleaning supplies and broken glass. He could feel Riley's eyes on him, wide with shock and confusion, trying to reconcile the gentle father she knew with the man who had just systematically dismantled 4 armed attackers. That, Therick said quietly, was why I clean buildings instead of doing something more important. He moved quickly to secure the scattered weapons, his hands automatically checking each one for ammunition status and safety positions. The movements were smooth and practiced, another glimpse into skills that didn't match his supposed background. "Dad?" Rayleigh's voice was small, uncertain. Therick looked at his daughter, seeing his own fears reflected in her expression. This was the moment he'd dreaded for 3 years, when the careful fiction of their peaceful life would crumble and she would have to confront the reality of who her father had been before he became the man who made her breakfast and helped with her math homework. "I'm still me, kiddo," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true anymore. "Just with some skills I don't usually need to use." Frank was checking on the unconscious Shaw, his own military experience evident in the professional way he assessed the man's condition. "He's alive, but he's going to have a hell of a headache." "What did you hit him with?" "Pressure point technique," Therick replied absently, his attention focused on the building's security systems. The monitors were still dark, Shaw's jamming device still active. "Frank, do you have backup communication capability?" "Emergency phone line, hardwired to bypass the main system," Frank confirmed. "But Therick, these guys were here for Miss Farrowin. If they had her location and access planned, there might be more of them already in the building." Therick had reached the same conclusion. Shaw's team had been too small for a complete extraction operation in a building this size. They were either the advance team or the backup contingent, which meant Cindy Farrowin was still in immediate danger. He looked at the elevator bank, its brass doors reflecting the lobby's emergency lighting. 43 floors. Unknown number of hostiles. Civilian target with no tactical training. His daughter sitting behind him, trying to process the revelation that her father was someone she'd never really known. Smart play would be to secure the lobby, call for police backup, and wait for professionals to handle the extraction. It was the safe choice, the responsible choice, the choice that prioritized Riley's emotional well-being over the fate of a billionaire who'd gotten herself into whatever financial trouble had attracted Shaw's employers. But Therick had spent 3 years learning that the smart choice and the right choice weren't always the same thing. "Frank, I need you to call the police and tell them we have an active hostage situation. Multiple armed suspects, unknown number still at large in the building. Tell them to approach with caution and be prepared for electronic countermeasures." Frank nodded, already moving toward his emergency communication panel. "What are you going to do?" Therick looked at Riley, who was watching him with the kind of intense attention that meant she was trying to understand something that didn't fit into her 8-year-old worldview. "Riley, I need you to stay here with Frank. Can you do that for me?" "Where are you going?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Upstairs," Therick admitted. "There's a lady up there who needs help, and I don't think the police are going to get here in time." Riley considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important decisions. "Are the bad men going to hurt her?" "I'm going to make sure they don't." She nodded slowly, then looked at the unconscious men scattered around the lobby. "Are you going to hurt them?" It was the question Therick had been dreading, the one that cut straight to the heart of who he was and who he'd tried to become. "Only if I have to, kiddo. Only to protect people who can't protect themselves." Riley seemed to accept this distinction, though Therick suspected the full implications would take her much longer to process. "Be careful, Daddy. Always am," he lied, then kissed her forehead and turned toward the elevator dot behind him. Frank was already on the emergency line, his voice calm and professional as he reported the situation to dispatch. The unconscious men were beginning to stir, but without weapons or coordination, they posed no immediate threat. Shaw's jamming device could probably be disabled with enough time and technical expertise. But time was exactly what Therick didn't have. As the elevator doors closed behind him, Therick caught one last glimpse of Riley watching him with the kind of expression that would haunt him regardless of how this night ended. She was beginning to understand that her father was someone different than she'd believed. Someone capable of violence in service of protection. Someone who'd been hiding fundamental aspects of himself out of love for her. The elevator began its ascent toward the 43rd floor, carrying Therick back toward a world he'd thought he'd left behind forever. The elevator climbed through the Meridian Towers, floors with mechanical precision, each passing level marked by a soft chime that seemed to count down towards something inevitable. Therick stood motionless in the center of the car, his reflection multiplied in the polished steel walls, each image showing a different angle of a man caught between who he'd been and who he'd tried to become. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing through tactical calculations that felt both familiar and foreign. After 3 years of deliberate suppression, building layout, probable enemy positions, civilian protection protocols, extraction routes, the mental framework was intact, preserved by muscle memory and instinct, despite his best efforts to bury it beneath the simple routine of custodial work. The elevator passed the 20th floor, then the 30th, climbing toward whatever was waiting in Cindy Farrowin's executive suite. Therick had cleaned those offices dozens of times, knew every conference room and storage closet, every sightline and blind spot. Knowledge that had seemed irrelevant when he'd been emptying trash cans and vacuuming carpets, but which now felt like reconnaissance, intelligence gathered over months of unwitting surveillance. The 39th floor, 40th, 41st. Therick's reflection stared back at him from the elevator doors, and for a moment he saw not the gentle custodian who read bedtime stories to his daughter, but the operative he'd once been. Lieutenant Commander Therick Corvan, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, assigned to operations that officially didn't exist in places that weren't on any map. A man who'd specialized in impossible extractions and surgical eliminations, who'd been very good at solving problems that couldn't be solved through conventional means. Elevator chimed softly as it reached the 43rd floor. The doors opened to reveal a reception area that belonged to a different world than the utilitarian lobby 43 floors below. Soft lighting, expensive furniture, abstract art that probably cost more than most people made in a year. But the elegant atmosphere was wrong somehow, disturbed by subtle signs that made Therick's trained instincts flare with warning. A chair was turned at the wrong angle. A magazine on the coffee table had been displaced. The reception desk's computer monitor showed a login screen instead of the screensaver that should have activated hours ago. Small details that suggested the space had been searched, probably recently and certainly professionally. Therick moved through the reception area with fluid silence, his feet finding the spots on the marble floor that wouldn't produce sound, his body staying low and close to cover. The skills came back automatically, as if 3 years of forced retirement had been nothing more than an extended vacation from his true calling. The executive suite beyond the reception area was laid out in a pattern he knew well from his cleaning rounds. Cindy Farrowin's corner office occupied the far end, accessible through a corridor lined with conference rooms and support offices. Normally the space would be empty at this hour, but tonight lights spilled from beneath several doors, and Therick could hear the low murmur of voices engaged in what sounded like tense negotiation. He paused at the first lit office, pressing himself against the wall beside the door to listen without exposing his position. 2 voices, both male, one with a slight accent that sounded Eastern European. The encryption is more sophisticated than we anticipated, the accented voice was saying. She's not just being difficult. The system actually requires her biometric confirmation to access the core algorithms. Then, we get her biometric confirmation, replied a second voice. This one carrying the kind of flat authority that suggested military or intelligence background. Whatever it takes, the employer was specific about avoiding permanent damage. Dead CEO draws too much attention, makes the acquisition more complicated. Temporary damage then. Enough to ensure cooperation without compromising the asset. Therick felt something cold settle in his chest. They weren't talking about financial records or corporate espionage. Whatever Cindy Farrowin had created with her company's algorithms, it was valuable enough to justify a complex extraction operation and sophisticated enough to require her personal involvement to access. He moved past the first office toward the source of the light, his mental map of the executive suite guiding him through the maze of corridors and support rooms. The voices grew clearer as he approached, and he began to distinguish additional speakers. At least 4 men, possibly more, all discussing technical details that suggested they were part of a much larger operation. Then Shaw's lobby team dot at the corner of the corridor. Therick risked a quick glance around the edge, using a reflection technique he'd learned for reconnaissance in hostile territory. What he saw made him reassess everything he thought he understood about the night's events. Cindy Farrowin sat in her own conference room, surrounded by sophisticated electronic equipment that definitely hadn't been there during his last cleaning shift. Laptop computers, signal jammers, what appeared to be a portable server array, and several pieces of hardware he didn't immediately recognize, but which looked expensive and purpose-built. The men around her weren't just kidnappers or corporate extortionists. They were intelligence operatives, probably foreign, definitely professional, and clearly part of an operation that had been planned for months rather than weeks. Cindy herself looked composed despite the circumstances, her business suit still immaculate, her posture straight and alert. But Therick could see the tension in the way she held her shoulders. The careful control that suggested she was working very hard to maintain her composure in a situation that had moved far beyond anything her corporate experience had prepared her for. Ms. Farrowin, one of the men was saying, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone who'd had this conversation before. We can do this efficiently, or we can do this the hard way. But we're not leaving without access to the quantum dynamics prediction protocols. And I've told you, Cindy replied, her voice steady, that even if I wanted to help you, the system safeguards prevent me from providing that access remotely. The algorithms are compartmentalized across multiple servers with independent security protocols. No single person can compromise the entire system. It was a good lie, delivered with the kind of technical confidence that might fool someone unfamiliar with advanced computer security. But Therick could see from the expressions of her captors that they weren't buying. It actually, said the man with the Eastern European accent, our technical analysis suggests otherwise. The prediction protocols are centralized in a master database that requires your personal authentication to access. Biometric scans, voice recognition, probably some kind of behavioral pattern analysis. Very sophisticated, very secure, and completely dependent on your cooperation. Cindy's composed facade cracked slightly. Even if that were true, do you have any idea what those algorithms could do in the wrong hands? Market manipulation on a global scale, economic warfare, the collapse of entire financial sectors. That's not our concern, replied the man with military bearing, who seemed to be in charge of the operation. Our concern is acquisition and delivery. What happens afterward is above our pay grade. Therick had heard enough. The situation was more complex than a simple corporate kidnapping, but the immediate tactical problem remained the same. Extract the civilian, neutralize the hostiles, minimize collateral damage. The fact that the hostiles were foreign intelligence operatives rather than common criminals just meant he needed to be more careful about leaving survivors who might complicate the aftermath. He pulled back from his observation position and began moving through the executive suite, using his knowledge of the building's layout to approach the conference room from an unexpected angle. The operatives had clearly studied the building's security systems and primary access routes, but they might not have anticipated someone with Therick's particular combination of building, familiarity, and tactical training. The executive suites, Design included several features that most people never noticed: emergency exits, service corridors, and maintenance access points that connected to the building's mechanical systems. Therick had used these passages during his cleaning rounds, but now they became tactical advantages, ways to move through the space without being detected by people who were watching the obvious approaches. As he made his way through the maintenance corridor that ran behind the conference room, Therick could hear the conversation continuing. The operatives were growing impatient with Cindy's resistance, and their discussion was moving toward the kind of enhanced interrogation techniques that would leave permanent psychological scars, even if they avoided permanent physical damage. Therick paused at the maintenance access panel that would give him entry to the conference room, his hand on the handle, his mind running through tactical options. 4 hostiles, probably armed, definitely trained, in a confined space with a civilian who had no tactical training and no idea that rescue was even possible. The room's layout offered limited cover and multiple sight lines, meaning that any engagement would be close quarters and fast-moving. But there was something else, a consideration that complicated this simple tactical equation. These weren't just kidnappers or corporate criminals. They were foreign intelligence operatives conducting what amounted to an act of economic warfare on American soil. Whatever they wanted with Cindy's algorithms, it wasn't just about money. It was about national security, about the kind of advanced financial warfare capabilities that could destabilize entire economies, which meant that Therick's simple extraction mission had just become something much more complicated, something that touched on the reasons he'd left his previous life in the first place. Through the thin wall, he could hear one of the operatives saying something about time constraints and alternative methods of persuasion. The patient phase of their interrogation was ending, which meant Therick was out of time for planning and preparation. He opened the maintenance access panel and stepped into a world that was about to become very dangerous for everyone involved. The maintenance access panel opened silently into the conference room's storage alcove, a space barely large enough for Therick to crouch behind a cabinet filled with presentation equipment and office supplies. Through the gap between the cabinet and the wall, he had a clear view of the entire room and its occupants. 4 operatives, just as he'd estimated. The leader, a man in his 50s with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, sat directly across from Cindy. To his left, the operative with the Eastern European accent was monitoring multiple laptop screens that displayed what appeared to be network penetration. SOFDWA are actively probing quantum dynamic security systems. The other 2 men positioned themselves at strategic points around the room, their attention divided between watching Cindy and monitoring the approaches to the conference room. But it was the equipment that made Therick's blood run cold. Not just laptops and signal jammers, but specialized hardware he recognized from his previous life. Military-grade encryption processors, satellite communication arrays, and a particular model of portable server that was manufactured exclusively for intelligence agencies. This wasn't corporate espionage. This was a state-sponsored operation with resources that suggested significant backing from a foreign government. Miss Farrowen, the silver-haired leader was saying, his English accented but precise. I'm going to be very clear about our situation. My name is Colonel Dmitry Volkov, formerly of the GRU, currently representing interests that have invested considerable resources in acquiring your technology. We are not common criminals, and this is not a negotiation. Cindy's composure cracked slightly at the mention of Russian military intelligence. What could the Russian government possibly want with financial prediction algorithms? Volkov smiled without warmth. You underestimate the strategic value of your creation. Ms. Farrowen, your algorithms don't just predict market movements. They can influence them. In the right hands, they represent a weapon more devastating than any missile or bomb. The ability to collapse currencies, manipulate commodities, destabilize entire economies without firing a single shot. That's not what I built, Cindy protested, but her voice carried uncertainty that suggested she understood the implications of her own work better than she'd admitted. Perhaps not intentionally, Volkov conceded. But intention is irrelevant. You've created a tool of economic warfare, and my employers have decided it's too dangerous to remain in American hands. Therick felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. He'd heard briefings about Russian financial warfare capabilities during his last operational assignment, codenamed Operation Silent Thunder. Intelligence reports about sophisticated attempts to weaponize high-frequency trading systems and artificial intelligence, algorithms for economic destabilization. The mission had been classified at levels that required special clearance, and the details remained locked away in compartmentalized files that officially didn't exist. But he remembered enough. Silent Thunder had been a joint operation between Naval Special Warfare and the NSA, targeting Russian efforts to infiltrate American financial infrastructure. The operation had been terminated abruptly after intelligence suggested that Russian operatives had identified the American assets involved and were planning counteractions that could compromise national security. Therick had been reassigned immediately afterward, his service record classified and his identity scrubbed from operational databases. At the time, he'd been told it was routine security protocol. Now he wondered if someone had known this day was coming and had wanted him as far away from financial warfare operations as possible. The algorithms are compartmentalized, Cindy was saying, her voice stronger now, more controlled. Even with my biometric access, you'd need months to fully understand the system architecture. Fortunately, said the operative monitoring the laptops, we don't need to understand it. We just need to copy it. Your biometric access will allow us to clone the entire database structure. Our own analysts can reverse engineer the functionality at their leisure. Volkov leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. But we do need your cooperation, Ms. Farrowin. The system security protocols are more sophisticated than we anticipated. Multiple layers of authentication, behavioral pattern recognition, even stress analysis that can detect coercion. Your predecessor, Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, was quite thorough in her security design. Cindy's face went white at the mention of the name. How do you know about Elizabeth? We know many things, Volkov replied. We know that Dr. Hartman was your partner in developing the core algorithms. We know that she died in what appeared to be a random traffic accident 6 months ago. We know that her death left you as the only person with complete access to the quantum dynamics prediction protocols. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as the implications of Volkov's words sank in. Therick watched Cindy's expression shift from fear to horror to something that looked like rage. You killed her, Cindy whispered. Dr. Hartman's death was unfortunate but necessary, Volkov said with clinical detachment. She proved uncooperative when we approached her through intermediary channels. Her moral objections to the strategic applications of her work made negotiation impossible. Cindy's hands clenched into fists on the conference table. Elizabeth was my best friend. We built this company together. She trusted me to protect what we created. And now you can honor that trust by ensuring her work serves a greater purpose. Volkov replied smoothly. Economic stability is an illusion, Miss Farrowin. Markets rise and fall based on perception rather than reality. Your algorithms simply make that process more efficient, more precise. In our hands, they become tools of strategic deterrence rather than mere profit generation. Therick had heard enough. The mission parameters were clear now. Extract Cindy, prevent the theft of financial warfare capabilities, and neutralize operatives who had already committed murder to achieve their objectives. But something else was bothering him, a detail that didn't fit with standard intelligence operations. Volkov's accent was wrong. Therick had worked with enough Russian operatives during joint counter-terrorism operations to recognize regional variations in pronunciation and syntax. Volkov's English was too perfect, his accent too generically Eastern European. Either he was using a false identity, or he wasn't actually Russian at all. The operative monitoring the laptops suddenly looked up from his screens. "Colonel, we have a problem. The building security system just came back online. Someone downstairs has disabled our electronic countermeasures." Volkov's expression darkened. "How is that possible?" Shaw confirmed that all building security was neutralized. "I'm not picking up any communication from Shaw's team," the operative replied. "Their last transmission was over 40 minutes ago. Then we proceed with enhanced timeline," Volkov decided. "Prepare the coercion protocols." One of the positioned operatives produced a metal briefcase from beneath the conference table, opening it to reveal what appeared to be medical equipment. Syringes, vials of clear liquid, electrodes, and other devices that Therick recognized as pharmaceutical interrogation aids. They weren't planning to torture information from Cindy through pain. They were going to use chemical compounds that would make resistance impossible, while leaving no permanent physical evidence. The technique was sophisticated, professional, and completely illegal under international law. It was also the kind of enhanced interrogation method that had been one of the reasons Therick had left his previous life behind. He checked his position one more time, mentally calculating angles of attack and probable responses. 4 trained operatives, unknown weapons capability, sophisticated equipment that couldn't be allowed to fall into hostile hands, and a civilian who would become a liability the moment violence erupted. But there was something else. Something that changed the tactical equation in a fundamental way. These operatives had murdered Elizabeth Hartman and were planning to steal technology that could be used as an economic weapon against the United States. This wasn't just a rescue operation anymore. It was a matter of national security. Therick reached into his maintenance tool belt and withdrew a small device that he'd carried for 3 years but never expected to use. A compact emergency beacon, designed to signal his location to specific agencies that maintained monitoring protocols for former operatives in deep cover. Activating it would bring resources that could handle the aftermath of what he was about to do, but it would also end his anonymity forever. He thought about Riley, 43 floors below, trying to understand why her father had suddenly become someone capable of violence. He thought about the quiet life they built together, the safety of anonymity, the simple piece of work that didn't require moral compromises or classified debriefings. Then he thought about Elizabeth Hartman, murdered for refusing to cooperate with foreign operatives who wanted to turn her work into a weapon. About Cindy Farrowan, about to be chemically interrogated by people who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill anyone who stood in their way. Therick activated the beacon and prepared to become Lieutenant Commander Therick Corvan. One more time. The maintenance alcove became a launching point as Therick exploded into motion, his 3 years of forced retirement ending in a heartbeat of calculated violence. Therick emerged from the storage alcove like a force of nature, his approach so sudden and silent that the first operative never saw him coming. The man positioned near the window went down hard, Therick's forearm catching him across the throat in a blood choke that cut off both air and consciousness in under 3 seconds. The operative's weapon clattered to the floor as his body went limp. The second positioned operative was turning, his hand moving toward his concealed weapon, when Therick reached him. A precise strike to the radial nerve paralyzed the man's gun arm, followed by a knee strike that doubled him over and an elbow to the back of the neck that sent him crashing into the conference room's presentation screen. Volkov and his technical specialist were scrambling for weapons, but Therick was already moving, using the conference table as both cover and weapon. He flipped it toward them with controlled force, its weight and momentum creating chaos while giving Cindy time to dive behind the overturned furniture. "Stay down and stay behind me," Therick called to her, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people obey without question. "When I say move, go to your left toward the emergency exit." Cindy pressed herself against the conference room wall, her business suit torn and her perfect composure finally shattered. But her eyes were alert, tracking Therek's movements with the kind of analytical intelligence that had built a billion-dollar company. Volkov had cleared his weapon and was bringing it to bear when Therek launched one of the metal briefcases at him. The case struck the Russian's wrist with precise force, sending the gun spinning across the floor while pharmaceutical interrogation equipment scattered like expensive confetti. The technical specialist was younger, faster, and managed to draw his weapon before Therek could close the distance. But he made the mistake of trying to shoot around the overturned conference table instead of moving to a better firing position. Therek used the man's hesitation to grab a presentation pointer from the scattered office supplies, extending his reach just enough to strike the pressure point behind the specialist's elbow. The gun dropped as nerve conduction temporarily ceased, and Therek followed up with a combination that put the man down for good. Volkov was the last one standing, and he proved to be more formidable than his subordinates. Instead of going for another weapon, he produced a combat knife with the fluid motion of someone who'd been trained in close-quarters combat. The blade was military issue, designed for both utility and killing efficiency. "You're not building security," Volkov observed, circling around the overturned table with the predatory patience of an experienced killer. Military bearing, tactical awareness, close-quarters combat proficiency. American Special Operations. Probably Navy based on your movement patterns. Therek didn't respond, focusing instead on the knife's position and Volkov's footwork. The Russian was good, probably Spetsnaz trained, definitely experienced in knife combat. This wouldn't be the quick, efficient takedown that had worked on his subordinates. "You know what's interesting about former Special Operations personnel?" Volkov continued, feinting with the knife to test Therek's reactions, "is how they always think they're fighting for something noble. Justice, freedom, protecting the innocent. But in the end, you're just another weapon pointed by people who never get their own hands dirty." "Maybe," Therek replied, his voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "But at least I'm not pointed at innocent women who trusted their government to protect them." Volkov lunged with professional speed, the knife angled toward Therek's center mass in a killing thrust. But Therek had fought knife fighters before, and he knew that speed could be turned into a disadvantage. He sidestepped the thrust while trapping Volkov's wrist, using the Russian's forward momentum to drive him into the conference room's smartboard with devastating force. The knife clattered away as Volkov rebounded from the impact, dazed but not finished. Therek didn't give him time to recover. A series of precise strikes targeted nerve clusters and joint locks, systematically dismantling the Russian's ability to continue fighting without causing permanent damage. Volkov collapsed beside his scattered equipment, conscious but clearly defeated. "This accomplishes nothing," he said through gritted teeth. "My employers will send others. The technology is too valuable to abandon. Then they'll have to go through official channels," Therek replied, already moving to secure the scattered weapons and sensitive equipment. Cindy emerged from behind the overturned table, her analytical mind processing what she'd just witnessed. "You're not a custodian." "I am now," Therek replied, though he knew the statement was no longer entirely true. "But I used to be something else. What kind of something else could do what you just did?" Before Therek could answer, the conference room's emergency lighting suddenly activated, and the building's public address system crackled to life with Frank's voice. "All building occupants, this is security. Federal law enforcement is en route. If you're on floors 40 through 45, move to the stairwells immediately and proceed to the lobby for evacuation." Therek's emergency beacon had worked, faster than he'd expected. The agencies that monitored former operatives in deep cover had protocols for rapid response when those assets were reactivated. Within minutes, the Meridian Tower would be crawling with federal agents who would take control of the situation and everything in it. "We need to move," Therek told Cindy, helping her to her feet. "Federal agents are coming, but we need to be somewhere safe when they arrive." "What about them?" Cindy asked, indicating the unconscious operatives scattered around the conference room. They'll be taken care of, Therick assured her, though he suspected that Volkov and his team would disappear into the federal detention system in ways that would leave no public record of their existence. As they moved toward the emergency exit, Cindy grabbed his arm. The equipment. The laptops, the servers, everything they brought. If there are copies of Elizabeth's work on those systems. Therick looked back at the sophisticated hardware scattered around the conference room. Standard protocol would be to leave it for federal evidence teams, but Cindy was right to be concerned. If the Russians had managed to partially penetrate quantum dynamic security, their equipment might contain fragments of the financial warfare algorithms that had gotten Elizabeth Hartman killed. Can you determine what they accessed? He asked. Cindy was already moving back toward the technical specialist's workstation, her fingers flying over keyboard commands with practiced efficiency. The intrusion logs show multiple penetration attempts, but the core algorithms are intact. They got into the peripheral systems, but never breached the central database. How long to make sure there are no copies on their equipment? 2 minutes if you help me physically destroy the hard drives. They worked together with focused intensity, Therick using improvised tools to dismantle the Russian equipment while Cindy guided him to the critical components that needed complete destruction. It was a strange kind of partnership, the former special operations officer and the billionaire tech executive, united by the need to prevent financial warfare technology from falling into hostile hands. As they finished destroying the last of the Russian equipment, the sound of multiple helicopters approaching the building became audible through the conference room windows. Federal response was arriving in force, with the kind of overwhelming presence that suggested this situation had triggered high-level national security protocols. Therick, Cindy said as they moved toward the emergency exit, whatever happens when those agents get here, I want you to know that you saved my life tonight. You saved your own life, he replied. I just provided tactical support. She smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth he'd seen from her all evening. Is that what you call systematically dismantling 4 trained operatives with your bare hands? That's what I call doing what needed to be done. They reached the emergency stairwell as the sound of boots in the main corridor indicated that federal agents had reached the 43rd floor. In a few minutes, Therick would have to explain why a custodian had military-grade combat skills and access to emergency beacons that could summon federal response teams. His carefully constructed new identity would be examined and probably dismantled by people who specialized in managing former assets who'd been activated in the field. What will you tell them? Cindy asked, apparently thinking along the same lines. The truth, Therick replied. Most of it anyway. And what about Riley? Your daughter? The question hit him harder than any of Volkov's attacks. Riley was still in the lobby with Frank, probably being questioned by federal agents who would want to understand her father's background and capabilities. She would learn things about him tonight that he'd hoped she'd never have to know, and he wasn't sure their relationship would survive the revelation. I'll figure it out, he said, though he had no idea how. As they started down the emergency stairwell, Cindy reached out and touched his arm again. For what it's worth, I think you're a good father. Whatever you used to be, whatever you had to do tonight, you did it to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. That's not something to be ashamed of. Therick looked back at her, this woman who'd built an empire on predicting the unpredictable, who'd lost her best friend to foreign operatives, who'd just watched him dismantle trained killers with techniques she'd probably never imagined existed. Thank you, he said simply. Together, they descended toward whatever consequences waited for them in the lobby. Below. The lobby of the Meridian Financial Tower had been transformed into a federal command center. Black-clad tactical teams moved with practiced efficiency, securing perimeters and establishing communication networks. Mobile command units lined the street outside, their satellite arrays and electronic surveillance equipment turning the quiet Seattle evening into something that resembled a military operation. a military operation. Riley sat in a chair that had been positioned well away from the scattered debris of Therek's earlier fight with Shaw's team, her marine biology book clutched in her lap like a talisman. Federal agents in suits had replaced the paramedics who'd initially responded to Frank's emergency call, and she watched them with the kind of intense curiosity that suggested she was trying to understand how her quiet evening of homework had turned into something from a movie. Frank stood nearby, answering questions from what appeared to be a senior federal agent whose bearing and age suggested significant authority within whatever agency had responded to the situation. The unconscious members of Shaw's team had been removed, but evidence markers indicated where each had fallen during Therek's systematic dismantling of their operation. Special Agent Sarah Mitchell of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division looked up from her notes as Therek and Cindy emerged from the emergency stairwell. Mitchell was in her early 40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that had made her one of the Bureau's leading experts on economic warfare and foreign financial intrusion. She'd been briefed on the situation during her helicopter ride to the scene, but seeing the actual participants helped her understand the scope of what had occurred. "Miss Farrowin," Mitchell said, approaching them with professional courtesy that didn't quite mask her intense curiosity. "I'm Special Agent Mitchell. I understand you've had quite an evening." "That's one way to put it," Cindy replied, her composure mostly restored despite her disheveled appearance. "I assume you're here about the Russian operation?" Mitchell's eyebrows rose slightly. "You identified them as Russian?" Their leader, Colonel Dmitry Volkov, was quite forthcoming about his background and objectives, Cindy replied. "They were after my company's financial prediction algorithms, apparently for use as economic warfare tools. We'll need a complete debrief," Mitchell said, then turned her attention to Therek. "And you are?" "Therek Corvan," he replied, meeting her gaze directly. "Building custodian." Mitchell consulted a tablet computer that contained information she'd received during her approach to the scene. "Mr. Corvan, our preliminary analysis suggests that you have skills and capabilities that extend beyond typical janitorial work." Riley looked up from her book, her attention focusing on the conversation with the kind of intensity that meant she was trying to understand something important about her. "Father, I have some background that proved useful tonight," Therek admitted. "What kind of background enables someone to single-handedly neutralize multiple trained operatives?" Mitchell pressed dot before Therek could answer. Another federal agent approached the group. This man was older, with gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with classified information and compartmentalized operations. His credentials identified him as Deputy Director James Harrison of the NSA Special Activities Division. "Agent Mitchell," Harrison said, "I'll take over the questioning of Mr. Corvan. This situation has been reassigned to Joint Task Force Authority." Mitchell looked surprised but stepped back professionally. Interagency politics were above her pay grade, and Harrison's authority was clearly significant enough to override her jurisdiction. Harrison approached Therek with the careful attention of someone who'd dealt with former special operations personnel before. "Lieutenant Commander Corvan, it's been a while." Riley's book slipped from her hands as she heard her father addressed by a military rank she'd never known existed. The sound of the book hitting the floor seemed unusually loud in the sudden quiet of the lobby. "Deputy Director Harrison," Therek replied evenly. "I wasn't expecting a personal response. Your emergency beacon triggered protocols that haven't been used since Operation Silent Thunder," Harrison explained. "When a former asset activates deep cover emergency procedures, we pay attention." Therek was aware of Riley's intense stare, of Cindy's growing understanding of just how far beyond janitorial work his background extended, of Frank's surprised recognition that the quiet man he'd worked beside for 3 years was someone entirely different than he'd appeared. The situation required reactivation of certain skills, Therek said, carefully. According to preliminary reports, 4 Russian intelligence operatives were attempting to steal financial warfare technology from Miss Farrowin's company. You intervened, neutralized the immediate threat, and prevented the theft of algorithms that could have significant national security implications. That's an accurate summary, Therick confirmed. Harrison looked around the lobby, taking in the evidence of the evening's violence and the professional manner in which it had been resolved. Your tactical assessment was correct. The technology in question represents a clear and present danger to American economic security. Your actions tonight prevented what could have been a catastrophic intelligence loss. Riley stood up slowly, her young mind working to process the implications of what she was hearing. Daddy, were you a soldier? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with all the trust and confusion that had defined their relationship since the moment Therick had chosen to act, rather than remain invisible. I was, sweetheart, Therick said gently, kneeling to meet her eyes at her level. Before you were born, before I became your dad, I was in the Navy. I did some special jobs that required me to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Like the lady upstairs? Riley asked, glancing toward Cindy. Yes, like Miss Farrowin. Riley considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important revelations. Are you still a soldier? No, Therick said firmly. I'm your dad who cleans buildings and helps you with your homework and reads you stories about brave rabbits. The soldier part was a long time ago, but you remembered how to do soldier things when people needed help. Riley observed with the clarity that only an 8-year-old could bring to complex situations. Yes, I remembered. Harrison watched this exchange with the professional detachment of someone accustomed to managing the aftermath of classified operations. But even he seemed moved by the obvious bond between father and daughter. Mr. Corvan, Harrison said, your former classification status will need to be reviewed in light of tonight's events. There will be debriefings, paperwork, probably some adjustments to your current situation. Therick felt something cold settle in his chest. The quiet life he'd built with Riley, the anonymity that had protected them both, the simple routine that had allowed him to be just a father, rather than a former operator with classified skills and dangerous knowledge, all of it was about to be examined and possibly dismantled by people who specialized in managing national security assets. What kind of adjustments? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. That depends on several factors, Harrison replied diplomatically. Your willingness to consult on similar situations, your daughter's security requirements, the ongoing nature of the threats that tonight's operation may have exposed. Cindy stepped forward, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came with building a billion-dollar empire. Deputy Director Harrison, if I may make a suggestion. Harrison looked at her with polite attention. Miss Farrowin? Mr. Corvan saved my life tonight and prevented the theft of technology that could have been used as a weapon against our country. Rather than disrupting his life with bureaucratic adjustments, perhaps we should be finding ways to ensure he and his daughter can continue the peaceful existence they've built together. That's a generous sentiment, Harrison replied. But Mr. Corvan's capabilities and knowledge make him a valuable asset for future operations. I'm not an asset, Therick said quietly, but with the kind of finality that made everyone in the lobby pay attention. I'm a father. I chose this life for a reason, and tonight doesn't change that choice. Riley moved closer to him, her small hand slipping into his with the kind of trust that made everything else seem secondary. Harrison studied them both, his expression suggesting he was weighing multiple considerations that extended far beyond the immediate situation. The world has a way of finding people with your skills, Mr. Corvan. Tonight proves that. Then the world will have to find someone else, Therick replied. I have more important responsibilities now. As if to emphasize his point, Riley squeezed his hand and looked up at him with the kind of expression that contained everything he'd been fighting to protect. Harrison nodded slowly, his professional assessment apparently concluding that some assets were more valuable when left in place than when reactivated. We'll need those debriefings. And there may be situations where your expertise becomes necessary for national security. I understand, Therick said. But your current life, your daughter's security, your anonymity, those can be protected if you're willing to serve as a consultant, rather than an active asset. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than Therick had expected. The quiet life he'd built might be slightly less quiet, but it would remain theirs. I can live with that, he said. Riley looked around the lobby, taking in the federal agents and the evidence of her father's capabilities, and the woman who'd nearly been kidnapped by foreign spies. Dad, can we still get pancakes tomorrow morning? Therick looked down at his daughter, this amazing little person who could process governmental conspiracies and international espionage, and still focus on the most important questions. Yes, sweetheart, he said, lifting her into his arms. We can still get pancakes. As the federal agents began the process of securing the scene and debriefing the participants, Therick held his daughter and reflected on the evening's events. He'd managed to save Cindy Farrowen, prevent a significant intelligence theft, and preserve the peaceful life he'd built with Riley. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Sometimes enough was everything. 3 weeks after the incident at the Meridian Tower, Therick sat across from Riley at their kitchen table, watching her work through a math problem with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else in her 8-year-old world. The morning sun streamed through their apartment window, illuminating her concentration as she carefully wrote out each step of a multiplication equation that would have been challenging for most kids her age. There, life had settled back into routine, but it was a different kind of routine now. The federal debriefings were complete, the paperwork filed in classified databases that would never see public scrutiny. Deputy Director Harrison had been true to his word about protecting their anonymity, but the knowledge of what Therick was capable of hung between them like a shared secret that changed the weight of ordinary moments. Dad, Riley said without looking up from her homework, do you miss being a soldier? The question came out of nowhere, the way her most important questions always did. Therick had been expecting it for weeks, ever since the night she'd learned that her father was someone more complex than the gentle custodian who made her breakfast and helped with multiplication tables. Sometimes, he answered honestly, setting down his coffee cup. I miss feeling like I was making a difference in the world. But I don't miss the danger or the uncertainty or being away from the people I love. Riley considered this with the seriousness she brought to all complex topics. The lady on the news said you saved a lot of people that night. Therick hadn't wanted Riley to see the news coverage, but information had a way of finding curious 8-year-olds, despite parental precautions. The media reports had been carefully managed by federal authorities, focusing on corporate security breaches and foreign economic espionage, without mentioning specific tactical details or personal identities. But Riley was smart enough to read between the lines. I helped one person who needed help, Therick corrected gently. That's different from saving a lot of people. But Miss Farrowen's company helps millions of people with their money, right? So if you saved her company, you kind of saved millions of people. The logic was flawless in the way that children's reasoning often was, cutting through adult complexities to reach simple truths. Therick smiled despite the weight of the conversation. You're pretty smart for someone who still thinks matching socks are boring. Riley grinned, but her expression quickly became serious again. Are you going to have to do soldier things again? I don't know, sweetheart. I hope not. But if someone really needs help, and I'm the only one who can provide it, I might have to use those skills again. Will you tell me about it if you do? Therick reached across the table and took her small hand in his larger one. I'll tell you as much as I can, in ways that won't scare you or give you nightmares, deal? Deal. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at their apartment door, gentle but persistent. Therick wasn't expecting visitors, and the federal agents who'd been handling his case had completed their interviews weeks ago. He approached the door cautiously, old instincts automatically assessing potential threats even in the safety of his own home. Through the peephole, he saw Cindy Farrowin standing in the hallway, holding a small wrapped package and looking uncertain in a way that was completely different from the confident executive he'd met 3 weeks earlier. Therick opened the door, surprise evident in his expression. "Miss Farrowin, I wasn't expecting to see you. I'm sorry to drop by unannounced," Cindy said, her voice carrying the kind of nervousness that suggested this visit was important to her. "I wanted to thank you properly, and I thought Riley might like something." "Miss Farrowin is here," Therick called to his daughter, who immediately appeared at his side with the curiosity that defined her approach to new experiences. "Hi," Riley said, studying Cindy with frank interest. "You're the lady from the news." "The one with the robot money," Cindy laughed, the first genuinely relaxed sound Therick had heard from her. "I guess that's one way to describe financial algorithms." "Your father tells me you're interested in marine biology." Riley nodded enthusiastically. "Did you know that some octopuses can change not just their color, but their skin texture to match their surroundings? It's like natural camouflage that's way better than anything humans can make." "I didn't know that," Cindy admitted, glancing at Therick with an expression that suggested she was beginning to understand why he'd chosen fatherhood over continued military service. "That sounds like the kind of advanced technology my company tries to create. But nature got there first." She handed Riley the wrapped package, which turned out to contain a hardcover book about deep-sea creatures with photographs that were both scientifically accurate and breathtakingly beautiful. "This is amazing," Riley breathed, flipping through pages of bioluminescent jellyfish and prehistoric-looking deep-sea fish. "Thank you, you're welcome. Your father did something very important for me, and I wanted to do something nice for his family." Riley looked up from her book with the kind of direct gaze that made adults slightly uncomfortable. "Are you and Dad going to be friends now?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither Therick nor Cindy had been prepared to address. Their relationship had been forged in crisis and maintained through professional necessity during the federal investigation. But what it might become in the normal world was still undefined. "I hope so," Cindy said after a moment, looking at Therick rather than Riley. "If your dad wants to be friends." Therick felt something shift inside him, a recognition that the woman standing in his doorway wasn't just the billionaire CEO who'd needed rescuing 3 weeks ago. She was someone who'd lost her best friend to foreign operatives, who'd built an empire while fighting isolation, who'd shown courage under pressure and grace in the aftermath. "I'd like that," he said simply. Riley beamed as if she'd successfully solved a puzzle that the adults had been struggling with. "Good. Dad needs more friends who understand about important things." As Cindy prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Therick, I know you chose this life for good reasons, and I respect that choice. But if you ever decide you want to do something that uses more of your capabilities, quantum dynamics could use someone with your background on our security team." "Thank you," Therick replied. "I'll think about it." After Cindy left, Riley returned to her homework with renewed focus, occasionally glancing at her new book about deep-sea creatures. Therick watched her work, thinking about choices and consequences, about the complexity of building a life that balanced safety with purpose. "Dad," Riley said without looking up from her math, "I think Miss Farrowin likes you. What makes you think that?" Riley shrugged with 8-year-old wisdom. "She brought me a present, but she kept looking at you the way you look at pancakes on Saturday morning." Therick laughed despite himself, recognizing that his daughter's observational skills were becoming as sharp as her analytical mind. Maybe, he thought, there were different kinds of important work in the world, and different ways to make a difference without sacrificing the peace they'd built together. 6 months later, Therick stood in the executive conference room on the 43rd floor of the Meridian Tower, but this time he wore a suit instead of a custodian's uniform. The room had been completely renovated since the night Volkov and his team had turned it into an interrogation center. New furniture, updated security systems, and reinforced glass that could stop rifle bullets made it clear that quantum dynamics had taken the lessons of that evening seriously. As head of corporate security, Therick found himself in the strange position of protecting the same building where he'd once emptied trash cans and mopped floors. The irony wasn't lost on him, though he discovered that his years of invisible observation had given him insights into the building's vulnerabilities that traditional security assessments had missed. Financial sector threat assessment is complete, Therick reported to the small group assembled around the conference table. We've identified 12 potential vectors for economic warfare attacks, similar to what Volkov's team attempted. I'm recommending enhanced monitoring protocols in partnership with federal cybercrime units. Cindy nodded from her position at the head of the table, her role as CEO complemented now by Therick's security expertise in ways that had proven more effective than either of them had expected. Their professional partnership had evolved over the months into something deeper, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of what they'd survived together. What's the timeline for implementation? Asked Dr. Sarah Chun, Quantum Dynamics' new Chief Technology Officer, hired to replace the algorithms and security protocols that had died with Elizabeth Hartman. 3 weeks for basic upgrades, 2 months for full integration, Therick replied. But the human element is always the biggest variable. Technology can be secured, but people make choices. It was a philosophy that had guided his approach to his new role. Security wasn't just about cameras and encryption. It was about creating an environment where people felt safe enough to make good decisions and report problems before they became crises. After the meeting, Therick and Cindy walked together toward the elevator, a routine they'd developed over the months of working in the same building. Their relationship had grown gradually, built on shared conversations about Riley's homework, quiet dinners after long days, and the kind of trust that came from seeing each other at their worst and choosing to stay anyway. Did Riley's science presentation go? Cindy asked as they waited for the elevator. She got an A+ for her project on adaptive camouflage in marine environments. Therick replied, pride evident in his voice. The teacher said it was graduate-level research presented at an 8th grade comprehension level. She's remarkable. You both are. The elevator arrived, and as they descended toward the lobby, Therick reflected on how much had changed since that night when violence had shattered their quiet existence. Riley had adapted to the changes in their lives with resilience that amazed him daily. She'd accepted that her father was more complicated than she'd originally understood, embraced Cindy's growing presence in their world, and continued to ask the kind of questions that kept both adults thinking about what really mattered. Are you happy? Cindy asked suddenly, her question echoing Riley's tendency toward directness. Therick considered the question seriously. I'm useful, he said finally. I'm making a difference in ways that don't require me to disappear for months at a time or lie about what I do for work. Rayleigh has a stable home, good schools, and people who care about her. You've built something that helps people while staying true to Elizabeth's vision of ethical technology. That's not what I asked. The elevator reached the lobby, and through the glass doors they could see Riley waiting with Frank, who'd become something like an honorary grandfather, since the night they'd all learned that ordinary people could be extraordinary when circumstances demanded it. Yes, Therick said, watching his daughter show Frank something in her marine biology book with animated enthusiasm. I'm happy. Are you? Cindy smiled, the expression transforming her face in ways that reminded Therick why he'd been drawn to her beyond their shared crisis. I'm learning how to be happy. It's different from being successful, but I think I like it better. They walked together toward Riley and Frank, toward this simple routine of family dinner and homework help and bedtime stories that had become the center of Therick's world. As they approached, Riley looked up and grinned at both of them with the kind of uncomplicated joy that made everything else seem secondary. Dad, Cindy, guess what? Mr. Frank says the building is getting a new aquarium in the lobby, and they're going to have some of the deep-sea creatures from my book. That sounds amazing, sweetheart, Theric said, reaching down to ruffle her hair. Can we stay and watch them set it up? Riley asked, bouncing slightly with excitement. Theric looked at Cindy, who nodded with the kind of indulgent smile that had become familiar over the months of their growing relationship. Sure, kiddo. We can stay and watch. As they stood together in the lobby where their lives had intersected that night, Theric felt the weight of choices made and consequences accepted. He was no longer the invisible custodian hiding from his past, but he also wasn't the operator he'd once been, defined by missions and classified objectives. He was something new, something that balanced protection with peace, capability with compassion, duty with love. Riley leaned against him while they waited for the aquarium installation team, her trust absolute and uncomplicated. Cindy stood beside them, no longer the isolated billionaire working alone, but part of something larger and more meaningful than corporate success. Outside, Seattle continued its eternal dance between rain and sunshine, the city moving through its rhythms while three people who'd found each other through crisis learned what it meant to build something lasting from the wreckage of their separate past lives. Sometimes the most important victories were the quiet ones, measured not in tactical success or financial achievement, but in the simple decision to stay, to trust, to build tomorrow on the foundation of today's small kindnesses. Riley looked up at her father with eyes full of curiosity about marine camouflage and aquarium design and the endless possibilities that stretched ahead of them. Dad, she said, are we going to get pancakes tomorrow? Theric smiled, remembering the promise he'd made in the aftermath of violence and uncertainty, a promise that had become the symbol of their commitment to ordinary happiness in an extraordinary world. Yes, sweetheart. We're definitely getting pancakes. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.